and it's all random. It's based on the different groups in the game. So like we have Levinji's Legion, there's Extra Corporation, there's Celestial Light Brigade, there's Charterhouse of Inquisition, just naming a few names. Each of those is its own minor faction. So when you do something for one of those groups, it changes the influence for that specific group, right? BGS affects power play and vice versa. So we're going to go into this a little later on. But what happens in the BGS area also affects what happens in power play. And what happens in power play changes how we look at BGS, which is why the two, if you look at a lot of people who run BGS, they also have some roles in power play. A lot of power play guys have roles in BGS and vice versa. And the biggest thing with BGS is it's constantly changing. Every day we have the tick, or it's about 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time that occurs. Every day there are new updates as far as the changing environment of BGS. Whose influence went up, whose influence went down, who started a war, who's just won an election, right? And if you notice, when we post those BGS updates, we post them every day because of this, as opposed to Power Play, where it all happens on the Thursday tick when the game starts the new in-game week. So
Yep,
just
when the news cycle begins.
right, yeah, when the new cycle begins, that's what they're called. Couple of key terms to recognize. So we already discussed minor faction. These are the individual groups in a system, right? So, Levinji's Legion, Celestial Light Brigade, Charterhouse of Inquisition, etc. Next is reputation. So this is the relationship between you as a player and a minor faction. So when you run missions with Levinji's Legion, your reputation goes up with that group. So no matter where they are, you will be a cordial reputation, a friendly, an allied, whatever your level may be. On the opposite half of that is influence, and this is how much control in a system a minor faction has. So if you go run a mission for Levinji's Legion, their influence will increase in, let's say you started the mission in Carthage. The influence will increase there. But it won't increase the influence in Mario Wang, because the mission had nothing to do with Mario Wang, right? So the reputation is you and the faction. The influence is the faction and the system that you're in. So next is the little plus mark. You'll see these on missions. This is an in-game representation of how much influence or reputation you receive. So for every plus, it's considered one influence or one reputation point. We'll go more with this in a little bit when we talk about missions themselves, but that's a very important term, that plus mark. Parity snap. This is when two minor factions have the same influence percentage. So let's say Faction A and Faction B both have 15% in influence. They're going to start a conflict, so a war or an election, and we'll go into that towards the end. But just know that term, parity snap. It means they have the same influence. The Mercury run.
Or
So
close to it.
Or
Because
close to it, yeah.
You can have a parity snap within 1% of influence. It's pretty rare, but it happens.
Right. Mercury run. So this is every day, every morning. We have the little bot that says, "Hey, tick just occurred. We need everyone to go look at the Mercury run and go gather data." That's all the Mercury run is: data gathering for all of our systems. Any of my fellow console plebs out there, we are unable to perform the Mercury run because FDev hates us and they don't give us the.
You had it right. You
Yeah.
had it right. FedDev.
Yeah. FedDev hates us. And they don't give us the second party tools like EDMC. So we can't run the Mercury run. This is something solely on the backs of our PC brethren. And the last term is tick, and I mentioned this one already. This is the time which a leech dangerous begins the next day or week, depending on when it occurs. So on every day is the daily tick. Also on Thursdays is the weekly tick, which is when we start the next week, or as it's called in Elite, cycle. Okay, any questions up to this point?
Exact time of the daily tick, please.
I think it's currently at like 6:15 Eastern Standard Time, 10 o'clock, 10:15 in game, right? That's when
AM?
it is about now.
AM? Okay.
AM, yeah.
It's 10:30 UTC.
Roger that.
So
Thank you.
So
for
6:30 Eastern Standard.
yeah, I'm Central, so it's 5:30 in the morning for me. So
Same here.
Yeah.
But it's not stable, it's changing.
Yeah, sometimes
yeah,
it changes.
it's-
You can use the command !tick, and that will tell you the most current tick time.
yeah,
Approximate.
time.
Approximate, yeah. Good question.
Where do we plug that in game or in Discord?
You do that in Discord. You could do it in the bot spam channel.
Okay.
Check chat voice. Everybody should be in chat voice if they have questions. This is how you run it. Just type in tick. Well, if the bot has access to the channel, but I don't think it does.
Probably have to do it in bot spam or
Barracks
BGS
will work.
operations.
It'll work in barracks. God damn it! What the fuck?
It didn't work in barracks, did it?
No, it didn't work in barracks.
Alright. Let me know when
It
you're
worked
done.
in spam. Prod got it in bot spam.
Okay, so if you look in bot spam, you'll see how the tick command works. Any other questions come through, Nat?
Not yet.
Okay. So moving on. So next thing we're gonna go over is government archetypes. So we talked about minor factions. We talked about how every minor faction is different from one another. Part of how they're different is they all have a specific government type as well as a government archetype. So the government type is like patronage or feudal, right? The Legion is a patronage government type. But we also have an archetype, which is the overarching area of government. So I'm gonna just put up all of the archetypes and we'll go through them. So first off, the first two, anarchy and corporation. Those are just normal government types, but those two are unique from the rest because there is no overarching government archetype. So if it's an anarchy's the only thing that has governments. That's the only government type within that archetype of anarchy. Same with corporation. Then you have the social archetype, which consists of communist factions, confederacy, cooperative, democracy, and theocracy. And then authoritarian, which is dictatorships, feudal, patronage, and the prison colonies. This plays into BGS because if two factions belong to that same archetype, then instead of going to a war conflict, they will go to an election conflict. The only exception to that is anarchy. They don't have elections, they always go to war. But let's say you have two corporations, they would have an election between each other. You have a feudal and a patronage, they would have an election with each other. But if it's a corporation and a feudal, they'll have a war with each other. Okay? This also plays an added role when we get to the power play stuff. But just to give you an idea about the difference between the governments in the game, as well as how that affects conflicts, which again we'll talk about later on. So now that we got all that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the actual BGS mechanics. So the first part we're going to talk about is system maintenance. So if you look on the BGS sheet, system maintenance is the parts that we put under first and second priority. Okay. When we perform system maintenance, we are keeping our influence level at a specific point, at a specific percentage in that system. And the reason we want to do this is because we don't want to always be expanding. You look at factions like Extra Corporation, they had 50 some odd systems when we started the war because they never stopped expanding. But a lot of those systems were bad in regards to power play, in regards to BGS operations, which ones conflicted with other player groups like ours. They didn't care about where they expanded. We, as our own player group, Lavingi's Legion, we want to make sure that we're not intruding in other player groups' territory. We don't want to go and start a war over some meaningless system. We want to make sure that we keep our power play triggers under control, and we're not hurting the other ALD powers through power play. So because of that, we make sure that our systems are at a specific level of influence. We try to keep everything at about 55%, which is why some of our systems we've been bringing down lately. Everyday actions is how you work on influence and system maintenance categories. So missions, trade, bounty hunting, exploration, scenarios, and search and rescue, which again are those categories that we're going to go over. Each of them has a different weight. So, for example, bounty hunting is pretty much the best way to increase influence in the game. There's a logarithmic algorithm that determines how much of each of these actions are going to influence or going to change the influence. And that's why we have the different number totals on the BGS sheet. We take into account those algorithms that we've discovered through research, and we put in the amount of work and the amount of benefits of influence that we need in order to reach the maximum gains, which leads to this idea of diminishing returns. Once you reach the top of this curve for the best gains, what starts to happen is you start to not get as much influence from doing the same amount of work. So let's say you do 3 million in bounties and you get 6 points of influence. All right, I'm making up numbers right now. All right, 3 million bounties, 6 points of influence. You may do 6 million bounties and you only get 7 points of influence because of this idea of diminishing returns. So that's only a 1 point influence for doing double the work. Okay, so that's why we have those goals in there, so that it's an idea of this is where we need to get to, and going past this too much won't effectively help us grow our influence that day. Any questions? So at this point, so this is the actual what it looks like if you were to look at the chart, right? So we have, going from left to right, the missions, scenarios. We have all 4 trade, which will go into why there's 4 of them. Search and rescue, exploration, and bounties. If you look at there's 2 red lines, and then above it, there's the white line, and it's 0 out of whatever amount. That amount is the approximate needed amount of that area in order to increase our influence that day. Okay, and we'll go into those amounts later on. So now we're going to start going over the actual completions of the areas. So like I said, there's these 6 areas. We're going to start with missions. We're just going to go in sequential order. So missions are just the actual missions that you gain from your contact from a station. All right, they go by specific minor faction. So most systems have 6 to 7 minor factions. So there's 6 to 7 groups of people that you can gain missions from each system. they have a different requirement for completion. There's all different types of missions. But for our purposes in BGS, the data courier missions and the donation missions are pretty much the best ones. Data courier because they usually average 2 to 3 influence points, those little plus marks that we talked about, and they don't take up any cargo. And donation because you pick them up and then you can just immediately donate, and they always offer at least 2 influence. So those are just super quick as far as completing missions. This is an important note. So sometimes you'll see missions search and that's find this resource and bring it back to us. I'm drawing a blank on what they're called. Source and return missions, where you have to go get X amount of a product and bring it back, or when you're doing a delivery. Even though these have to do with commodities, because they come from a mission, they go into the mission category. It doesn't go into the trade category. Okay? Now, another thing that's important with missions is the concept of failing missions. So, let's say you pick up a mission, you have it for typically 24 hours. If you are unable to complete that mission, it is important that before the mission fails, you abandon it. If it's for a faction that we're supporting. By abandoning the mission, so getting rid of it, deleting it before the mission expires, you will lose reputation with the faction, but the faction will not lose influence in the system. If you let the mission fail, you'll get the message saying the mission failed. If you go to your left panel, it won't say abandon anymore, it'll say discard. Once you discard that mission, not only do you lose reputation with the faction, but the faction will also lose influence in that system. This is a strategy that people use when we need to decrease influence in our systems. Sometimes we do this. Other times we simply support the regular other minor factions. In reality, both are needed. There's only a certain amount of positive gains that you can get without doing these negative failing influence practices. So again, if you cannot complete a mission, you need to make sure you abandon it before it expires. Missions with more influence plus, and the rewards give more influence on completion. So if there's 5 pluses, that's +5, right? If there's only 2, that's +2. Nat, I think you had something you want to add?
Yeah, also to add to the abandoning stuff, when you fail a mission, like you're deliberately failing it to cause negative influence, you have to actually discard the mission before the negative will take effect. So just be mindful of that. So like if you fail missions and you forget to discard them, you're not going to get that negative influence until you discard it.
Any questions on this?
How long can you hold a mission without discarding it? Indefinitely?
I believe it's 30 days before the system automatically wipes it from your panel.
Are you sure? Because I was holding on to some to a few missions, and then they just kind of disappeared.
This is really dangerous. Nothing is job.
Yeah, that might be something we have to do some research on. I've never held on to a mission after I failed it. I always just discard it right away. So I don't know personally.
So could they just disappear on the weekly tick, maybe?
Maybe. That could be something we'll add that to our research stuff, because we're always doing BGS research. And as soon as we have an answer for that, we'll make that public. That's a really good question. Thank you.
Sweet.
If we do fail a mission when we're supposed to be increasing influence, what should we record on the sheet?
So ideally you don't do that. So that's the first part. Ideally you don't do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I get that. But, you know, things happen.
Yeah, things happen. If it does happen, what I would do is I would contact someone with the Praetorian Prefect role, so like myself, Nat, Jings, and just let them know, and they'll tell you what to do from there.
Like right now, we're in the process of getting the sheet reworked and stuff, but we don't own it. Al Shane owns it, so anything that goes through the sheet that has to be changed has to be approved by him. So we're still waiting on those verdicts and stuff right now. So just carry on as you didn't fail it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In an ideal situation, we'll have so much influence increases that failing that one mission
Won't affect anything.
won't really affect anything too badly. All right. So real quick, so this is what the mission screen looks like. So here I took this picture in the Kamandu system, Kamandina, whatever, and you see right here, right? You see this purple box where the red laser pointer is. So this mission is rewarding influence. Now there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pluses next to that. So this is a +5 influence mission. Obviously I don't have the reputation to complete it because at this point, if you look up here, I was still neutral with the faction. And according to this, you need to at least be friendly. So you have to fill up this bar here for this one. All right. But if I were to have completed this mission, it would have netted me 5 influence. And then if you look up here, you'll see it's the same plus marks for reputation. But what changes is obviously it says reputation instead of influence. Okay. So that's what this screen would look like. And again, this is the number in this purple box. That is what you are looking for in BGS regards for missions. So now we're going to talk about scenarios. So to start, scenarios, for the most part, if you look at the sheet, scenarios aren't something that we complete a lot in normal system maintenance BGS because the increases for them, it just takes a long time to get a low amount of increase for scenarios. You can get roughly the same amount of time, the same amount of influence by doing one mission, and you'll do it in a quarter of the time. But it is important to go over what scenarios are. So these are just additional activities. So if you ever go in a system and you see like mega ships or mining areas, or even unidentified signal sources, those are scenarios that you would complete, right? So that extra combat stuff. And real quick, they aren't always combat. And we'll talk about that in a second. So when you complete a scenario, it will increase the influence for the winning side, as well as decrease the influence for the losing side. Makes sense, right? And it's on a scale of 1 to 3. So in the top right corner in your info panel, when you complete a scenario, it will say low increase, moderate increase, significant increase for influence. The first part that always comes up is the influence, right? And then that's a low is a ±1, moderate ±2, significant ±3. You have to be quick when you're looking because this, like I said, this is the first number that comes up. it's very quick to appear and disappear, and then right after it is your reputation gain from the scenario, and it uses the same wording, so it also uses low, moderate, significant. So you may complete something and only get a moderate increase for influence, but you might get a significant increase for reputation. And if you misread that to say that it's that's your influence and not your reputation, you could throw off your totals a little bit. And we'll go into this in a minute, but this is the same scale that's used in combat scenarios when we go into the war. And we'll reference back to this when we get to that, but keep that in mind that this is the same scale. There are two categories for scenarios: combat and passive. So combats are the mega ships, right? The orbitals, installations. Anytime if you have a unidentified signal source, anything regarding going in and protecting or disrupting a convoy, or as I said, the combat zones, which are war only. You'll only see those during a war. And then on the other side, the passive, so these are ones that don't require you shooting at anything, would be going to combat aftermaths and distress calls. Nat, you want to add anything for scenarios?
No, I mean, I usually avoid scenarios because they can be pretty buggy. And take forever to start, or they'll start and they'll never end. So, I mean, it's just luck of the draw with the scenario, really.
Wait, Frontier games are buggy? Say it isn't so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, remember, it's not
Alright.
bugs; it's a feature.
Yeah, it's a feature. You pay for that. Don't forget.
Alright, so moving on from scenarios. So trade. So trade is, other than bounties, trade is probably the best thing that you can do for influence. It's completed by buying commodities from one system and transporting them to another. So let's say we're trying to increase our influence in Vequess, like we have been. We could go to some system outside Vequess and go and look for a commodity, and then we bring that back to Vequess and we sell it at a station in that system. So that's what we're referring to when we do trade. Within trade, there are 4 different categories, and that's food, medicine, legal weapons, and legal other. It's really easy to know which is for what category, because if you look in the game, when you go to the commodity market, if it's under the food tab, it's food. If it's under medicine, it's medicine. Legal weapons is legal weapons. And then everything else goes under legal other. Okay, so very easy to know which category you're working on. Now, the most important thing about trade when you're doing this for influence is not only must it make a profit, so you are selling it for higher than you bought it for, but the system you're selling to must also have a demand. So if you go and you buy landmines for a system and their demand is 0 for landmines, you're not going to increase the influence. But if it's 1 and you sell 100 landmines, you will get an influence increase. Negative trade, so that would be selling stuff for a loss, so buying it for more than you sell it. And black market trade will decrease the influence. Now, in ALD controlled space, black markets are pretty much disabled. So for the most part, we're lucky enough that we don't have to worry about black markets, but negative trade is something we have to worry about. My first time trading, I accidentally had a negative trade, and I luckily asked before I did. I said, this number it's red, not green. Do I sell this or not? And I was told, You don't sell it in that system because it's going to decrease our influence, and it would harm us more than help us. So in that situation, you just find a different system to sell in, and you make sure you don't do that route again. And the biggest thing with this is only sell to stations controlled by supported faction. So, as everyone knows, through BGS, different minor factions own the stations. When you do anything regarding trade or anything that goes through the in-game contacts of the station, that goes as influence for the station controller. So if we're supporting faction A and you go to a station supported by faction B and do trade for them, that trade will go towards their influence totals, not ours. So now I'm going to show you guys just how I personally set up for influence. So this is Inara. For anyone who's not familiar with it, it's one of the primary outside tools involved with Elite Dangerous. So what you do is you go to the Inara website and you click on this top. First off, make sure you're logged in. So you see I'm logged in on the side, and you click on where it says Market, and that will bring you up to this page. When you first press Market, it's going to bring you to whatever last system the game has you logged in as. So let's say we're doing, we want to do trade into Carthage. So you would go type in the star system box, you would type in Carthage, you press the select button, and then this exact screen that I have pulled up right now would be what comes up. So now you have to decide which station you're going to sell at. So you can click any of these 4 stations. I have Cook Depot. Personally, I recommend not doing it because it's a planetary, but when I took the screenshot, I didn't realize I had Cook Depot selected. So we're going to go with Cook Depot. So you'll click on that station because that's where you're going to sell. And then you'll scroll down a little bit and find the part that says import to Cook Depot. So this is saying import is when you bring something into the system. So this list shows you in order the profit so the highest profit value and the commodity that you get from that profit value. So when I took this screenshot a couple of days ago, if I were to sell to Cook Depot, I could get 27,130 credits per ton if I bought ergonomic treatment from Grant Terminal in Nigeria. Okay. Now notice that the same ergonomic treatment has different profit values. It's all the same commodity, but it's a different profit value because all of these stations are selling it for a different price. All right. One other thing with this tab, if you look on this left side, there's all these different symbols. This symbol right here, which is also this one there, means that terminal, that station, is a medium pad outpost. All right. This one here that looks like the house or the factory, that's a planetary port. So you'll have large pads. And then you have the one that looks like the Coriolis starport. That is a starport and it has large pads. So this is important. So let's say that way you don't go to a medium outpost and have a large ship and you just wasted your trip because you can't dock. All right, so that's always something that you want to look at. And I just find this the easiest because it automatically updates and it's very clear as to what the profit would be.
Also, with the stations, planetary ports, there's 2 different kinds. You will have the planetary outpost and a planetary starport. The planetary starports are the big ass bases with the circle around it that have just has 40 docking ports, just like a starport does, except it's on a planetary. And a planetary outpost only has 2 to 4 large pads, and then the same with like mediums and smalls. So you got to keep that in mind, because you might go to a planetary outpost and you're in a large ship, they have a large pad, but somebody's taking up the pad. So you would have to wait or whatever. So keep that in mind too.
With that, Nat, you might know this better than me, but does Inara actually have a different symbol if it's a planetary port or outpost?
No.
No,
No.
it's all the same.
Okay, so there's no
you
way to
won't
check
actually,
that in Inara.
you won't actually know until you get to the station.
Gotcha.
And it'll tell you, like, when you select it, it'll say planetary starport, or it'll say planetary outpost.
Awesome, thank you. So now for the final part. So you've made your purchase for the ergonomic treatment. Now you need to record how much profit you're making. So right where this box is here, you see the green number. That is the actual profit that you're selling. So in this screenshot, I was selling 284 tons of coffee. So if you look up here, it's really faint, 1,847 credits per unit. That's how much the sell was going for. This total income here, 524,548 credits. That's how much the income is before the game accounts for how much I bought the products for. This green number, so again, 263,268. That is the total profit that I'm making on the sale. If this number is red, like I mentioned before, I saw the red number, that means that you are losing money on that sale. Do not sell to a supported faction if that number is red. With trade, so if you do mining, for example, this green number is going to be the same for this the total income number here, because you're.
You kind of cut out there.
Let's say you're mining, right? And you go and you mine. Well, you just use 284 tons of low temperature diamonds. Because you didn't buy that resource, you have no
Overhead.
overhead. Thank you. You have no overhead off that resource. So whatever the total income is will also be your total profit, because getting that resource technically costs 0 credits. So that's why mining is really good for BGS, because not only do you make a lot of money for it, but if you sell to the right system, you're covering a lot of that legal other category. Any questions?
Yeah, one question here. In situations where you have a negative profit and you're losing money, and you're going to be selling to a system that is one of the ones that you are supporting at the time, but it's not. It's over. What's the word I'm looking for here?
Over influenced?
Yes. Would that be a situation where you would want to sell it at a loss?
Yeah. So if we're looking to decrease our influence in a system, that's when you want to do loss trade or negative trade.
All right.
And this is a practice just like with failing missions. Negative trade is another practice that we do to lower our influence in systems that we have too much, or if we're trying to cause a faction to leave a system through retreat. But yes, if we're trying to lower the influence, then you want this green number to instead be red.
Or if we're trying to start a conflict.
Or if we're trying to start a conflict and overall, if we're trying to make the influence lower. Yeah.
Roger that.
Any other trade questions? So, moving on from trade, search and rescue. Just like with scenarios, this is one of those categories that we don't focus on a lot because there's very little benefit to running it. So this refers to any legal salvage operations, but we're not talking about ones from missions. So if you get a mission that says legal black box salvage operation, where you have to go collect the black box from a crash site, that still goes under the missions category. And those, for the most part, have a high influence amount, so you may want to do those. This is talking about, let's say you're exploring a planet in an SRV, and you find an occupied escape pod, right? That is what this is referring to. The problem with this is influence gains from search and rescue is not based on however many salvage items you get, but it's based on the total transaction. So let's say I find 5 escape pods, and I go to the search and rescue contact, and I put all 5 of those in one transaction. That only goes through influence-wise as one transaction. It's not a 5. So what you would need to do is you would need to hand in 1 escape pod in one transaction, then back out of the search and rescue contact, hand in the second one as a second transaction, and so on. Now, another thing, search and rescue does not refer to passenger missions. So recently we had all of those terrorist attacks on Imperial space. Those passenger missions still go in that missions category. It does not go in listed as search and rescue. That's it with search and rescue. Okay. Any questions on that?
Okay. I think Max wanted to add something to the trading.
Go ahead, Max. I gotta fix the slides real quick.
The demand, the higher the demand you get, the more influence you get in trade.
That was something I missed that he had mentioned to me. Yeah, so if the demand is 1, you'll get X amount of influence, but if demand is 10, you'll get 10 times the amount of influence, just putting the numbers, making them up.
As long as there is demand, you'll get the most out of the transaction.
Yeah.
But if it's at specifically 0, you won't get as much.
Yeah.
As long as it's not 0. If you sell at 1,000 demand, it's the same as if you sell at 1. But once it gets to 0, it's pointless.
Yeah, at 0, you're basically spinning your wheels in the mud.
Okay. So now that I fixed the slides real quick, so now we're going to go into this last category, which is bounty hunting. So bounty hunting, as I mentioned earlier, is without a doubt the best thing you can do for increasing influence. So bounty hunting refers to whenever you kill a ship, whether it's an NPC or a commander, that when you scan is marked as wanted in that system. How wanted works is the wanted status goes by the system controller. So let's say you have a bounty on you from Levinci's Legion. Any system that is controlled by the Legion will mark you as wanted in that system. But let's say you go to a different system that isn't controlled by the Legion. You will no longer be marked as wanted because the controlling system, the controlling faction doesn't see you as a threat. The best places to go for bounty hunts are compromised navigation beacons and resource extraction sites that are labeled as hazardous. In both of these areas, there is no system security that comes to attack you. In the Haz-Res areas, the resource extraction hazardous, you tend to have a lot more bigger ships, but you also don't have as many ships as the CNBs, and usually they're in rings, so you have to really hunt around and find people. And the compromised nav beacons, everyone just all the NPC bounties just kind of spawn in, and as you fly around, more will continue to spawn, as long as you're in the range. So here I just have listed the CNBs and the Hazreses that are in Legion-owned space. So Ariel, Karinga, and Mario Wang all have compromised nav beacons. Mario Wang being the one closest to Vequess, the system we've been working the most lately, while Chalbandia, Muris, and Carthage all have Hazres. So depending on what you want to do, and depending on where you are, you may want to go look at one of these. And these all should be pinned in the BGS Academy channel, I want to say. It's either in Academy or Operations. But it's pinned
The
there
bounty
for...
hunting is, I think the bounty hunting's in both.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that. So you can always look
If
at
not,
any of
I'll get
those.
it in both.
Now the last thing for bounties is it is critical that you hand them in to the actual authority contact in the system. If you hand it into interstellar factors, 0 influence will be gained from that transaction. So you can hand in 10 million credits worth of bounties, but you hand it into the interstellar factor. Not only does it decrease the amount that you get as an individual, but it also makes sure that there is no influence gained because of that transaction. Fleet carriers have the same thing, except recent research that we've conducted suggests that there is some level of influence that goes in for fleet carriers. However, again, it's nowhere close to the full amount that you would receive from an authority contact. So while it may just be easier to cash into the fleet carriers, at the end of the day, you are again not receiving the same amount of credits, and you're not putting in the same amount of influence as you normally would be. Okay, we did search and rescue. Sorry, some of these slides got out of order. Okay. Back on track now. Apologize for that. So now we'll go to exploration. Exploration is just when you go to a different system and you scan the system or the planet through the galaxy. It's something that you really don't have to try hard to do. Any system that you jump into, you'll get some sort of level of scanning. Exploration gives you influence by selling to the Universal Cartographs contact. So let's say you are trying to increase the influence and you have a lot of exploration data. What you would do is you'd go to the starport services and you would find where it says Universal Cartographs and you would sell your data there. If you're the first person to explore a system or to explore a planet inside a system, then your sale for exploration data will be worth more. And that makes sense. You're making a remarkable discovery that no one else has. It's fresh data. So, of course, in a realistic situation, you would get more for that. Whereas if you're handing in the same data you handed a week ago, it may not be worth much. Now, this is something important. If you die before you submit your exploration data, you lose it. I went on my 5K trip a couple of months back, and right after I got back from it, I went to a conflict zone, and I got killed by another commander, and I lost all of my exploration data. Didn't get to hand any of it in to either Universal Cartographs for BGS or engineers to increase my rep with them. lost it all, never to be seen again. So that's something that you always want to remember and keep track of. And again, just like with trade, and search and rescue as well falls under this. It's important that you only sell to stations controlled by the supported faction. Real quick, here's just a picture of the universal cartograph screen. This number here, the sell page, this will sell, I think it's about 15 parts per page, 15 system data per page. This is the total amount if you were to sell the whole page. Now, if you look, there's these two systems here that are marked in red. I believe it's 20 light years is the minimum distance in order to sell cartographs data. So if you're within that 20 light year range from where the data is and you're trying to sell it, you won't be able to. Just know that the sell page number, so in this situation, there are two systems that are marked red, we can't sell. This number updates correctly to reflect being unable to sell these two. Now, one other thing to keep in mind, exploration is one of the worst ways to increase influence.
Yeah, exploration is like a very small scale for influence. Like you would need billions in exploration data to even get the effect of 1 or 2 missions.
And it's very hard to even compare it to the bonuses that you would get from bounties. It would take billions in exploration data to get close to the amount you would get for 5 million, which is probably about half an hour's work off bounties. Did someone have a question?
No, I think Max wanted to say something.
Did you say billions?
Close to it.
Close to it, yeah. If you think about it.
I spaced out.
Because I know 30 to 40 million doesn't do shit.
No, 30 to 40 million is like the peak of the curve.
Yeah.
That sucks, considering it takes so long to accumulate exploration data.
After that, it gets genuinely pointless. But like,
to show my age, used to you could go and drop 5 million in exploration data and get a full swing on a system in a day. Before freaking 3.3.
It's not as obvious with missions and bounties. Bounties 5 million is like 40,000 influence from missions. That's how hard DR kicks in for missions. But for exploration, it's not that bad. But it is quite expensive.
Well, before 3.3, you were able to control a system with 20 systems of exploration data. It doesn't work now anymore.
Nowadays, it means nothing.
Well, nowadays it can mean much. Nowadays it can mean much if the systems are worth something. But back in the days, it was the number that counted, and it could be a 10 credit system with only.
So at this point, we have reached the end of this system maintenance area. And we've introduced all of the main, all of the influence methods for increase, decrease, etc. So now we're going to start talking about conflicts. So this goes into, if you look on the sheet, it would be the war tab and the election tab. And we touched upon this a little bit. So when two minor factions reach parity snap, they get either at or within 1% of influence from each other, as we talked about earlier. They engage in one of 3 types of conflict. So those are elections, civil war, and war. So as we talked about earlier, election is when there are minor factions of the same government category or archetype. So if we were to go to, as a patronage government, if we were to go to conflict with another patronage or a feudal, we would start an election, not a war. If we were to go to war, if we were to have a conflict with a corporation, for example, that's a situation where we would have a war. And really the only difference between a war and a civil war is civil war only occurs when the system where the conflict is taking place is the home system for both of the minor factions involved. So for the most part, in our operations, we don't see civil war too much. We're mainly working on helping other factions, or if it's not helping ourselves go into a faction or increase our influence or defend our influence, we're usually working with factions that have a favorable government, as opposed to a non-favorable government. So we would see more so wars, and every now and again we'll have an election. But civil war of the three of them is the one that we see the least. Now, I have over here no combat actions for elections and no passive actions for civil wars and war. Those refer to those scenarios that we talked about. Scenarios play into war a lot, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But sometimes you'll still get those scenarios, even though we try not to run them that much. You'll get them in elections. If it's a combat scenario, or if you get a mission for a massacre mission, or if you're trying to do bounties, to help win an election, anything regarding combat does not have to do with elections. And then it's the opposite for civil wars. So if you're doing trade for a war, then that trade is going to be useless. There's no influence additions or subtractions based on that. But one important thing is that all three of these conflicts follow the same schedule. So you hit parity snap on the tick, so both factions are at 17% influence, for example. That is the first day, 1 day pending. And if you look on the Discord bot, you'll see pending as a hashtag and the conflict state, and usually it's a grayed out color. So if you were to look today, you might see some systems have pending wars, so it would be hashtag war in that grayer color. On the pending days, influence doesn't matter. So once something goes pending, there's no influence change for that for either of those two factions that day, so you don't need to do any work there. Then you have 4 to 7 days active, and the reason it's 4 to 7 is because it's whoever hits 4 first. It's majority wins. So I'll use the example of our recent election in Yabkameni. We won 3 days in a row, and then we lost the 4th day. So because we lost that 4th day, we had to go to a 5th day, which is when we won. That was yesterday. But if we hadn't lost that 4th day, then it would have just been 4 days, and then we would have been done. And then afterwards, you have 1 day of cooldown, which again, there are no influence changes on that cooldown day. Now, the last major thing when it comes to conflicts is diminished returns, as far as we know, do not exist in conflicts. So this means that really it just goes by totals. So whoever has the most amount of bounties, whoever has the most amount of combat bonds, whoever has the most amount of missions, whoever has the most amount of combat zones completed and won, average that amount out. Whoever has the most of that average would win the war that day. Same goes for election. So it's just a raw number. Whoever has the most wins. And then from there, it's the same rules as applies for system maintenance. As again, the trade rules still apply for election. It works the same way. Bounty rules still apply when it comes to handing in at an authority factor as opposed to handing in at a interstellar faction. So those other rules that we talked about with the system maintenance still applies. So this is the chart that you would see on the BGS sheet. The top one would be for wars, and the bottom one would be for elections. We've covered all of these areas. The only one that we specifically did not talk about is this one right here, combat bonds. And combat bonds is just the amount of credits that you earn from killing a hostile inside a CZ. So you would just hand that in. It's not the authority contact, it's the combat bond contact. It's one spot over to the right on the contact screen. That's when you go into that section. All right. Any questions about conflicts?
I guess one thing.
Okay. Yeah.
How much are the war missions worth? So you get strategic data transfers, kill vulnerable generals, stuff like that.
Strategic data transfer does not go into the influence. Like I said, it's only the combat related ones. So if you have the massacre missions, or if you have hunt down traitor or deserter, those will go for the combat missions. And then from there, it's the same thing. You'll see the plus marks on the mission screen, and you just put in. So if it's 1+, it would go as a 1 in this combat missions category. If it's 5, you'd put a 5 in. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where do we find these spreadsheets at?
So if you look on the daily orders for BGS, so go to the BGS updates channel. There is a link posted within the update every day that leads you to the sheet. We are going to go over the sheet in a few minutes. So but before we do that, we're going to talk about just those connections between BGS and Power Play. So hold on to that question. And dictatorship, we are weak against. So let's say there is a system. One of our control systems has 15 systems inside its sphere. As long as half of those systems, so if it's 15, 8 out of the 15 are controlled by a patronage or feudal government, then that will help decrease the amount of fortification needed within that sphere. Meanwhile, if there's dictatorships involved, because we're weak against those, that will increase our fortification triggers. This was a big issue as to why we started to fight Extra Corporation, because they are an ALD aligned faction, but they are also a corporation, and they didn't like that we wanted to put patronage. We, as the ALD power, wanted to put patronage and feudal governments in charge of systems, so that we didn't have to fortify as much, and we would get the bonus for having the reduction of triggers. So as long as half of the systems are of that favorable government, then we don't have to fortify as much.
Yeah, see it.
Yep.
Okay. So looking at the sheet, so if you go to, and unfortunately I can't do it on the screen share, I don't think, but if you go on Discord, you can go to the BGS updates channel, and in that's where we post the daily orders. So you'll see today Jinx posted the orders, and if you scroll down a little bit, right under where it says the objectives with the number order, it says please record your efforts in the tracking sheet and the tracking spreadsheet, and then there's the link. That link goes directly to this sheet. all of the explanations that I just gave you guys is summed up in less words in these 6 little boxes. Okay, and then this tab here just goes over using it. So I'm going to go over using this as if I've never been on the sheet. So if it's your first time on the sheet, first you're going to read this entire page. Then you're going to click on this tab that says Commanders. And here you'll see everyone who is listed on the sheet. So what you'll do is you'll go down to the bottom, and we'll just call this one Lecture Example. And then you'll put your rank in. And this bar is for so that when we give out awards for people, anyone who's an Optio or higher, so the yellows like myself or purples, aren't eligible for awards. So this just helps us make sure that we're keeping track of who is and isn't eligible. So for this, we'll say that I'm a Legionnaire, right? We'll go to the first priority tab. So first you can go to this Overview tab, and this will show you all of the daily orders. And it will show you this bar here is just a percentage of how completions are. This bar up here, this is the no BGS bar. Under no reason, there is no reason to do any BGS operations on this bar for Levinci's Legion. These are the systems where our influence is too high, and we need to make sure it real quick. So the number up top for the missions, that's our subtotals for today. When we put a number in for our example, it increased the number. And the same will hold true. So let's say we go to legal other trade, and let's just say we do 1 million's worth of trade. That will, by putting that number in, it automatically increases the number that we have up here. It adds the percentage, and our totals are accounted for. Same for bounties, same for everything else. So any first priorities you'll find on this tab. You see we got Ariel, Carthage, the Tuba. Those 3 were trying to lower our influence. And then we have our other system that we're working today where we need to increase our influence. So same thing, you just put your name in the Commanders tab, and then you just record what you're doing that day. Second priority looks exactly the same, so there's no reason to look at that. And unfortunately today we don't have any war or elections in the actual sheet, but we were able to see what wars and elections look like right there. So does anyone have any questions on the sheet? I know there was one question that I was going to answer at this point, so can that guy please just restate your question again, and then I can answer that.
I was just asking where the spreadsheet was, and you already answered it. So.
Okay, perfect. So are there any other questions about the sheet? I think Nat died, so I'm just going to take a quick look at chat voice and see if there's any questions that got posted in there.
No, the actual the actual hauling of fortifications and which systems they go to, and how is it actually done, and how do you update it in the PP updates channel and all that?
Different. So
are we
I
gonna
thought
go
it's a
over that?
BGS lecture today.
So that's a power play thing.
But
yeah.
actually, I can, if you remind me, I can get on explaining that later on.
Yeah, well, we can do that at the end because, like I said, we're gonna have questions and we'll go over some more of the power play stuff.
Okay.
But that's definitely that's more so related to the power play aspect, which I think we might try to do a power play lecture at some point. Unfortunately, the BGS lecture stuff is, for the most part, already written, so we would have to take a little bit to actually design the power play lecture and figure out a curriculum for it. I'm just gonna leave.
We have a guide for it. It's pinned in power play discussion.
Yes, there is a. There is
okay, I'll look at that. Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so heading back to our thing. So
Sorry,
we've
I had
gone
to
over the
switch
sheet.
from the car to my headset because I just got home and my fucking headset's retarded.
So now we're gonna go into our example where we bring all of this stuff together. So yesterday we announced to the Legion, hey, this is why we've been working Vequess so hard. For a really long time, we've been trying to get into the system of Cemiess. I'm just gonna show you guys real quick how long. Slides are once again out of order, but I'm gonna show you guys just how long. Praetorian Prefect channel. That's where we do all of the BGS planning. And if you can see right here, our friend Valen, on October 23rd, 2018, almost 2 years ago, this is the first time we said, it was said in the channel, couldn't we try to expand to Cemiess? They had this whole conversation, and then Valen said, give me 2 years and it will be done. Well, now we're finally at 2 years, and we're just about there finally at this point. So just going back a little bit, this is the actual timeline. So in July of 2018, that's when the prefect says, all right, we're going to go into Vequess. It took a month to retreat a faction and then build the Legion's influence up to get into Vequess. And before we take control is when Valen posts that comment about, hey, let's take Cemiess. It's a high pop system. It's in the ALD sphere. It's a good system to be in. So that's when the prefect first discusses the expansion. And then a few weeks later is when we finally have Cemiess in Vequess rather in control. And then for 2 years, the Legion worked in Vequess to gain the final asset in the system. I had just joined the Legion a few months prior. I was working with Nat here on gaining that final asset, and I can tell you guys that it was definitely a hard fought election. And just like we're having trouble getting Vequess up in influence now, that was the issue there. It's a very high travel system, so that means there's a lot of commanders going in and out, and it's very hard to increase influence.
Hurka, you've cut out after a very hard system too.
How about now? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Nope, can't hear it.
Perfectly.
Okay, so that's why Vequess is a very hard system to increase the influence in. High traffic. There's a decent amount of factions. A lot of those factions in Vequess are native. So you can work there really well. But once we gained that final asset in Vequess, we started to work on finally pushing into Cemiess and finally working that. Unfortunately, FedDev must have a spy in the Praetorian Prefect, because they created the whole terrorist attack on the Legion and put one of those attacks in Cemiess. And what that did was it made it harder for us to increase influence and to work operations in that system, because now we had to worry about all of these gankers and all of these guys who are just running the CG on every system, PC, Xbox, PS4. Everyone was in Cemiess that week. So that's when we said, you know what? If we really want to do this, we need to add Vequess to the normal Legion-wide BGS orders, because that traffic was bleeding over into Vequess. Anyone here who has a fleet carrier that had one that week knows that you could not get a spot in Cemiess, and within a day or two, you couldn't even get a spot in Vequess. That's because Vequess is the closest system to Cemiess, which is why we went there in the first place. So, and then yesterday, a lot of people had started to say, you know, why are we working Vequess so hard? What's the end goal here? So it was decided that, you know, you guys have worked really hard for Vequess the last couple of weeks. there's no reason to not share with you guys what our end goal is. But the point of this slide and the other one with Valon's comment is just to show you that BGS is something that literally takes years to plan and to execute the plan properly. It's not something that you just kind of wake up one morning and you're like, okay, yeah, let's do this, and the next day it's done. It takes time, and it's one of the biggest grind areas of the game, as a comparable to, in my opinion, engineering and Guardian stuff. So now, like I said, we've been in Vequess and Cemiess for 2 years now, and we've used all of the BGS influence additions. We've worked through multiple different theories. We've disproven theories through operations in these systems. So we have 3 major lessons about that we've learned about BGS from these systems, and that is negative influence for opposing factions is just as, if not more important than positive influence for the supported faction. So there's only a certain amount of influence that a faction can gain every day. And again, that goes into algorithms. Octio Max here, he's done a lot of the BGS work behind determining what those algorithms are and really revising some of our theories to what we have today. And part of that has been this realization that if we don't drop the influence of other factions that we're working against, we cannot properly increase our influence on levels that actually affect the percentages every day. So those days where we get like 2 or 3 percentage points, that's just us doing positive. But if we do enough negatives, we can get 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 percentage increase in influence. So those negative actions are just as important, if not more, as positive actions. So again, negative trade, failing missions, especially donations, and murder. Those are some of the 3 best ways for influence. So the next thing, half completing every area of influence contributions is better than fully completing half the areas. So, and this goes for basically everything but bounties because of how overpowered bounties are. But like we talked about before, there's this concept of diminished returns, where once you get to a certain point, you don't get enough influence. Well, that diminished returns number changes for every one of those buckets, as they're referred to: the trade bucket, the bounty bucket, exploration bucket. So if you get half of every bucket, you're not going to reach that diminished returns. But if you only do a few of those buckets and you go you hit that level or you go above that level, you're going to start to hit diminished returns and you're not going to get the same amount of influence. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Makes sense to me.
Okay. And this was something that Nat said to me when I said, is there anything else I should add? He said, bounties are like crack. And it's true. Bounties are the absolute best way to increase influence. There's really nothing comparing to bounties, and that's why our bounties numbers, we always say, stress bounties and trade, because bounties and trade are the 2 best things when it comes to influence. Okay. That's the end of the lecture. Kind of went a little longer than I wanted to, but I think everyone learned a lot. Does anyone have any questions that we haven't covered yet? And I'm gonna just log out of the sheet real quick. Before I do, just these are where I got my stuff from. So lecture notes, conversations with Max and Nat, and then online searches through Elite Dangerous and the Elite Dangerous wiki page that has all of the information.